Uh, 6 months ago, I knew nothing about this at all. And it came about like this, because I was on Easter Sunday, I was talking to a group of my grandchildren, of whom I've got lots, 9 of them, and explaining to them what Easter was all about. And then one of them said, "No, you mean that when they went to find Jesus in the tomb, he wasn't there? Well, obviously he wasn't dead." And I thought, well, that's all right. I said, well, actually he was dead. We all know that because he died on the cross. Do doctors ever make a mistake about whether somebody's died or not? And the answer, I had to be honest, is yes, they sometimes do. People occasionally wake up in the morgue. And I thought, well, everybody knows that isn't a good argument for a grandchild. So I thought I'd better do some research and actually find out, as far as I could, what happened. And so this is a forensic inquiry using whatever sources I can to try to find out what actually happened. And I'm going to use evidence as I would almost in a court of law, as we would in a hospital if something goes wrong. You find out what happens from words, things that people have said or people have written. And if you've got any pictures, you look at the pictures. And you do all of that before you analyze or try to make up your mind. So that's what I'm going to do. And when we get to the end, I will give you my conclusion. But you listen to the evidence and make up your own minds, because I'm not in a position to say I'm right. All right, let's start with the structure of the talk. We're going to look at the sources first of all, giving enormous importance to written sources, particularly closest they were to the event. People's memories are always unreliable, and so eyewitness accounts are the most important. And if eyewitness accounts are written down, then that's a high quality evidence. And so we're going to look at the Gospels. We're going to see what historians subsequently thought about the event. And there is very, very little that historians have written, because the story, once it's started, becomes church dogma and really not legitimate for historical research. I'm going to mention one or two myths and visions which feed into the story as the years go by, and we're going to look at paintings. The reason for that is that for most people, for the first 1,500 years, had no access to words. There were a few books, a few manuscripts. Most people couldn't read. Most people couldn't get at the books. So what they knew about the crucifixion came from pictures. So we're going to see what was generally known from pictures and see whether the art itself informs the investigation. And then when we've finished with the sources, I will go through the medical aspects of the key events in the Passion story. So starting from, I don't know how to get rid of that yellow thing. No, it's only on mine. Starting with the Gospels. And the Gospels are the fundamental basis of the whole story. And as you know, there are 4 evangelists. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were eyewitnesses who gave their opinions to people who subsequently wrote it down. They didn't write the Gospels themselves. And if you look at the Bible, it will say the Gospel according to Matthew, not written by Matthew. And when you read them, it reads rather like a sort of press release event where people are being told something, and then the journalists go back and write it down. And the 3 main Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, their accounts of what went on are very, very similar. They're not identical. They don't use the same words, but they're obviously coming from a common source. When you come to St. John's Gospel, it's rather different in that he repeats many of the things that go on in the other Gospels, but he also adds some things. And he adds some things that are not strictly eyewitness things. And he has other agenda. Also, his is the Gospel that was written furthest from the event. In all cases, you have to wait 60 years for the first written account. There are other Gospels, the so-called apocryphal Gospels, none of which shed any important light onto the events of the crucifixion, so I'm not going to go into those. Just to mention Nicodemus' Gospel of 450, because he does add some names. He gives the names of the two thieves, and he gives the names of the centurion with the lance, but he gives no other details. And the base material are these fragments of manuscripts. Now, if you look at what historians wrote, there is remarkably little. The most important historian was a Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, who was writing nearly contemporarily, but in fact also 60 years after the event. And this is a quote from his history. Jesus was the Messiah and a wise teacher who was crucified by Pontius Pilate. And when I looked into this, the academics who know about it question whether he even actually wrote it. But using it as evidence, it's all we've got. The Roman historians, of which Pliny and Tacitus are the most important, they just mention the event, but without any details at all, that there was a man called Christos who died under Pontius Pilate, and no more information. And then you have to go 200 years further forward to Eusebius, who wrote the first history of the church. He was not so interested in the physical events, he was interested in the history of the church. And I'll come back to him for one particular event. And after that, nothing. Historians don't touch it. The church defines what the dogma is, and until you get to the Enlightenment until the 1750s, then particularly German historians begin to ask proper historical questions. And one of which is actually the same as my grandchildren: did he actually die? And I will look at their suggestions, but that way of thinking dried up in about 1900, and then it hasn't been approached since. An important final source is Jim Bishop, who, an American, wrote, he went to Jerusalem and he did forensic research to try to find out exactly what happened, as I'm trying to do. And he wrote a best-selling book, 3 million copies sold, called The Day That Christ Died. And that's probably the most thoughtful historical source that there is. Then just to mention the church, because the church obviously has its own account of the event. And the only one that is clearly relevant to what happened at the time of the crucifixion is from the Council of Nicaea, 325, and this is part of the Creed, the Nicene Creed, which is just a repeat. This happened. He suffered, died, and was buried. And no further information. And then going to go forward in history, the events that might or might not give us more information. The most important next event is the conversion of Constantine. And this is Piero della Francesca's painting, where an angel carrying a cross appears to him in a dream. And this is before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And when he wins the battle, he converts to Christianity, stops persecuting Christians, and gives credence to the Christian religion, who previously worshipped the sun god. And then, in blue, I've color-coded this because then we see a legend which begins with his mother Helena, Saint Helena, who, with the family becoming Christian, she went to Jerusalem. Where I'm in blue, it for me means I can question the validity of the evidence. But the story goes like this. They're all good stories. She went to Jerusalem to find the true cross. And she wandered around a bit, nobody would tell her where it was, and somehow, miraculously, she found 3 crosses in a ditch. And in order to validate which was the true cross, she also found a woman who was dying, and she passed each cross over the dying woman in turn, and one of the crosses cured her. And therefore, that was the true cross. She then carried the true cross back to Jerusalem and took fragments of it back to Constantinople with her, and there are fragments of the true cross as relics. Has been said, heavy enough if you put them all together to drown a ship. So once you get into relics, you get into very unreliable history. But she came back also with the nails. I'm going to give a bit of time to nails. She gave them to Constantine. One of them he turned into the bit for his horse, and the others later turned up in other places. So we'll do a bit about nails. And then this is the sort of way that that legend of pretty dubious accuracy creeps into the story. If you go to Santa Croce, you can see this Geddes sequence of paintings about St. Helena finding the true cross. And here she is carrying it. And if you look at her assistant here, she is carrying 3 nails. I've blown up the picture, and here are the nails with surprisingly pointed heads. And we'll come back to the shape of the nails later. Whether any of this happens, I've no idea at all. But in trying to be honest in the investigation, these are the facts that we have to deal with. This story was written in the book, The Golden Legend, a very influential book about the lives of the saints, and therefore has been taken as, use the word stupidly, gospel truth ever since. But historians who've looked into it, they've doubted many of the stories, and in particular this story has come in for a lot of doubt and criticism. I'm now coming to, it's difficult to know how to handle this evidence. This is St. Francis, who, in a vision, an angel appears to him in the form of Christ on the cross. And after his vision is over, he has the stigmata. He has nail wounds in his hands and in his feet, and he has a lance wound in his side. Now, I don't know what to do with visions. Are they true, are they not? But the account of the vision is probably true, in that it was written down immediately after the event by a monk who was traveling with him at the time. So we have to admit this is possible evidence of nails and where the nails went. And now I come to a most surprising vision by St. Bridget. Here she is in a painting, in a breviary that was done sometime after the event. But she, after the vision, she wrote them all down. And this is a vision that she had in 1360, which was extremely influential in the way that the church taught about the crucifixion. And she, within the vision, she, as it were, interviewed Christ. So we have firsthand evidence of from Jesus himself. And he told her, she asked him, and he told her that he had received 5,480 blows. Whatever, you don't have to worry about the number, but that's a fact to put in. And this is what she then wrote down, that he was taken from the cross, received his body on her lap. He looked like a leper, covered in bruises and blood, lifeless eyes and cold. And that's a description of a dead man. I just want to point out in passing, enjoy her hat and her handbag, but look also that she's wearing a little label. And that is the label of Christ's face, a little representation of Christ's face. And I'm going to come back to that with one of these other strange myths. Now we're going to look at some of the pictures, the images that represent the crucifixion, and see what we can learn from them as sort of evidence of what happened and evidence of the way that the church was thinking at its time. This is usually said to be the first one, 440 on a church door in Rome. And there you see 3 crucified people, Christ in the middle, the 2 thieves, and their arms are in an interesting position. He's not hanging from the cross, none of them are. They're just symbolically representing crucifixion. And if you look at the doors in detail, there are no crosses. So these are just symbols of crucifixion and don't tell us much about what happened. A contemporary ivory carving gives us a bit more information. Here on the right, you have Christ, again in the same interesting arms out gesture, nails in his hands, nails in his feet, wearing a sort of loincloth. And look at his attitude. He's alive, he's fully awake, eyes are open, and he's in a gesture of either triumph or blessing. But very definitely alive, not obviously suffering. And we know he's alive because here is Judas in the same carving who has just hung himself. And so the sculptor wants you to see death and life. And in this you have the way the church is thinking of Christ's death on the cross was in a way a triumph over death. And here is a sort of pictorial example of it. Then the next one is in an illustrated gospel. It's artistically without any very great merit, but it contains all the important parts of the gospel story according to John. You have the two thieves who are nailed, you have Christ who is nailed, you have the lance going into his side from the centurion whose name is actually written Longinus, and you have a bystander with a bowl of what we're going to come to later, of wine vinegar and herbs, that is being given to Christ on the end of a stick on a sponge. But note what Christ is wearing. He's wearing a priest's clothes, the so-called colobium. He's not wearing a loincloth, and he's not naked. And this is the way that the church was encouraging Christians to see. And then as you go through the years, you find the same representation of the crucifixion, with Christ wearing the priest's clothes, again, arms outstretched in triumph or blessing, and then the events. One event just worth mentioning, you'll see these wedges stuck in the ground where the upright of the cross is. And this is quite good evidence that this central upright of the cross was permanently there. The whole cross was not removed. The vertical cross was planted in the ground, and then the horizontal part was taken for the event of the crucifixion. Note that Christ does not have a crown of thorns. Now we come to two examples, both in the Uffizi. And these are fascinating because you have this is the moment of transition. This one, they're both from 1200. This one is labeled, catalogued as Christus Triumphans, again, the triumphant Christ, arms out, not hanging, not suffering, live, eyes open. 4 nails, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you'll see in one of the little side pictures, you'll see the flagellation going on, and I'm going to come back to the flagellation as a very important part of the story. But you see now the transition to Christ suffering, where the shape of the body has changed into an S shape. He's not yet properly hanging, but he's either dead or dying. And so the lesson that the viewer is going to take from this is quite different from the triumphant one. And then eventually you get to the ones that you're more familiar with, which is the suffering Christ. We're into the 15th century, Fra Angelico, with crown of thorns, blood, no question that this is to demonstrate not suffering, not a priest, not triumph. This is the disaster of the crucifixion. And I've chosen the Grunewald one as the most harrowing of the crucifixions you can find, all to do with suffering and death. So the story has now changed to death and suffering. I'm now going to go to a completely different sort of sense, and these are the stations of the cross. And if you go into almost any Catholic church, you'll see on the walls the 14 stations of the cross, either as pictures or more usually as sculptures. And this became very common from about 1500 onwards, and was a way of teaching the congregation, and children in particular, the events of the Passion. And this is a modern children's summary, and it's worth looking at because the stations of the cross are always the same, or almost always the same. I'm not going to go through each of them, but I want to draw your attention to some. Look at number 2, Jesus takes up his cross. Number 3, he falls down. Number 5, he falls again. Number 7, he falls for the 3rd time. And number 9, second time, falls for the 3rd time. Now, if you then compare this, which is the teaching of children and teach the Catholic teaching with what was written in the Gospel. Much of this never happened. Here is, I've given you a quote from Luke. It's exactly the same in Matthew and Mark. As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon of Cyrene and put the cross on him and made him carry it. Christ did not carry the cross. Now, for me, that's an important forensic fact. Why didn't he carry the cross? This was the usual way of handling a crucifixion, was to make the condemned man humiliated and also carrying the means of his death. But the Gospels are very clear that this did not happen. Apart from John's Gospel, which has some different angles on it, and in this he did carry the cross. But then you get into a complicated bit of theology of referring back to another event in the Bible. So I'm taking as the probable correct version the majority version from the Gospels. And then I want to draw your attention to number 4. Jesus meets his mother, fairly well known, not mentioned in any of the Gospels. And then number 6, Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. And you'll be familiar with Veronica paintings of Christ's face. Again, never mentioned in any of the Gospels. And I'm going to just chase this bit of mythology further down because it's a central part of the crucifixion story, and it's probably an entirely wrong later addition. So we're now going to do the story of Christ's face, which, if you remember, was being worn by St. Bridget and is represented in endless paintings, particularly in the Orthodox Church. It's the so-called mandelion. Mandelion is the Greek word for a towel. And the story behind it goes like this, and it is the most amazing story, which you probably haven't heard, unless you're an Orthodox. And it goes like this, that it's all written down, all the words are in Eusebius's history. And he quotes directly a letter from King Akbar V of Edessa, written to Christ, saying, "I'm ill, I've heard of you, I know you can perform miracles, please will you come and heal me?" And then there is the correspondence the other way. Christ replies, and all his words are written down in the history, saying, "Sorry, I'm busy, I can't come and cure you, but I can send my disciple." And he sends the disciple and cures King Akbar. Now, within that story appears, and it's not easy to find out why, a towel with Christ's face on it. And it's the first time it comes. And this is then subsequently part of the story and part of the iconography, particularly in the East. This is the earliest one I can find in St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, where the towel with Christ's face is printed on it. And it then becomes part of the Catholic tradition as well, because this towel then appears 500 years later in Edessa, and then 500 years later in Constantinople. And then after the sacking of Constantinople, the towel disappears and then reappears in a number of centers in Western Europe, all of whom claim it is the original. There's one in the Vatican, there's one in Genoa, and there is one in Notre Dame. And they're probably all completely fake. It's very difficult to believe this whole story. And the Veronica story comes from that, and it's in the Golden Legend. So here is the evidence for you, but I'm spreading quite a lot of doubt on it. And then Christ's face, this is the Genoa one, undated, but said to be contemporary. And then you have the Turin Shroud. And I can't duck the Turin Shroud. It's evidence of pretty dubious validity. And it's the same face again. So now I'm going to just do the Turin Shroud forensically. The photograph on the left is the body face on. You can see a very convincing looking image of a body. And this is seen from the back. And the key things to note that people have interpreted from the Turin Shroud. I'm taking the Turin Shroud as if it were a piece of evidence. There's a vast amount of evidence to say that it's a fake, but I'm not going to do that because many people believe it, and it is still part of the story. These stripes on the back are said to be the stripes, the scars from the flagellation. And if you go to the shoulders, there are this whiter patch there on that shoulder and on that shoulder are claimed to be bruising from Christ carrying the cross, something he probably didn't do. Then if you go to the wrist here, you can see what is in effect a splash of blood, and this is taken to be where one of the nails went in. And this has caused all sorts of arguments because it's not in the hand, it's in the wrist, only on one side. And then finally, the lance wound, which is here, a big wound in the side on the right. Take that or leave it as evidence as you like. And I've now come to the end of the section on sources. I'm giving a lot of importance to the Gospels, particularly the three Gospels that agree with each other, and then feeding into it quite a lot of myth and quite a lot of legend, some of which, particularly the visions, need to be taken quite seriously, and some of which, I think the Taurian Shroud needs to be taken less seriously. So conclusion on sources, and the other conclusion is that the survey of the paintings and the Stations of the Cross, which is most people's education on the event, are full of inconsistencies. And so I'm putting my main conclusion is trust the Gospels and trust less and less as you go further forward in time. And now we're about halfway through and we'll go to the analysis. This is as much as we can do with the evidence. First of all, just to talk about the business of crucifixion. This is not Christ's crucifixion, it's the history of crucifixions, which starts in Persia and was a very common way of humiliating a criminal or your enemy. And it's the most appalling death, excruciating, the word is correct, slow death, in public for a humiliated person. And it's worth noting that the Romans, a Roman citizen, could not be crucified. It was only for lower classes and barbarians and criminals. And then the details of the cross, there are a number of crosses that were used. The only two that appear in the Christian iconography are the so-called Latin cross and the St. Anthony's cross. And then in many representations, there is a seat, and in some there is a footrest. Now that was part of the crucifixion historical story. By the way, I should have mentioned the largest number who were crucified at any one time was in the Spartacus revolt, when 6,000 of the rebelling slaves were crucified all in a line on the Appian Way. So people at the time and subsequently knew a lot about crucifixions because there were plenty. And then if you go into it, you find that nails were sometimes used, but rope often, nails being a bit more expensive and difficult, but we know most about the nails because they survive. Rope sometimes, and you'll remember one of the pictures I showed you, the thieves had ropes as well as nails. And then the usual period between crucifixion and death, usual, not always, was 1 to 3 days. And that's an important bit of information because from the Gospels, Christ was said to have died about 3 hours after crucifixion. So either you can't trust the Gospels or there was something else rather important to bring his death forward, which is my conclusion, as we'll come to in a moment. And then there was this rather strange part of the crucifixion, which was breaking legs. People would come, usually soldiers, and with metal rods would break the legs of the crucified person in order to hasten death. The idea here, it's difficult to know why they would do it. The idea is that the crosses had to be guarded to prevent relatives taking their relation down before he died. And so sometimes the soldiers who wanted to go home broke the legs in order to speed up death so that they could leave the crucifixion site. But this becomes relevant in Christ's crucifixion in a moment. I'm now going to do flagellation, which is mentioned in all the Gospels, is frequently shown in the pictures. And I think, well, I'm trying to persuade you, and not tell you, that the importance of the flagellation has perhaps been underestimated. We'll go through the pictures first and then go through a little bit of the evidence on flagellation. To begin with, there are very few flagellation images for the first 1,000 years, and the ones that there are almost entirely symbolic. Just a man tied to a post, man with a whip, nothing more than that. It didn't tell you anything about the actual event, what was used to flagellate with, how many strokes were given. And then as you go through the centuries, the pictures become less symbolic, more realistic. Here's Cimabue, but it's quite a gentle flagellation. It's again, largely symbolic and not very realistic. But you have two people flagellating, you have this multiple whipped flagellum. Then as you go through the pictures over the centuries, it becomes more and more and more violent. And in my view, more and more realistic. The purpose of flagellation was to inflict as much pain as possible, short of death. If you're interested in following this up, look at Mel Gibson's film of The Passion of the Christ, and you will see a flagellation sequence there which you can hardly look at. It's so horrible, but it's probably true. And this is the facts behind it. The Roman way of flagellating was to use this thing called a flagrum or flagellum, with usually 6, sometimes 9 different pieces of leather, to which were attached balls of lead and also animal bones. And the point of that is that both to maximize the pain, but also to do the most possible damage. And with the animal bones to dig into the skin and then drag across to produce more scarring and more bleeding. Seneca, in writing about flagellation, describes it as a half-death. And then as you look into the flagellation literature, it's clearly brings people very close to death, or they die. And in the case of the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, he records 70 different deaths from flagellation. This is not crucifixion, it's just the flagellation itself. And in Hebrew law, there was a limit of no more than 39 strokes. And that's because it's a funny number, but the reason is that the law said 40 strokes, but in case of a miscount, they stopped at 39. For the Roman tradition of flagellation, there was no limit at all. The British Army and the Navy bring us up to date, so this is the sort of evidence that we have to use, had a limit of 150 until a notable case in 1841, where a soldier called Fred Wright had 150 strokes, died afterwards, and he had a post-mortem examination. So we have very good evidence of what happens with flagellation. And they found damage to not just the skin and bleeding, but to the heart, the kidney, and lungs. So these metal balls are causing deep damage to the body. And after Fred Wright's death, the number of strokes permitted in the British Army went down to 50, and then 25, and then the whole business was cancelled. I just want to remind you of St. Bridget, who may not have been entirely accurate, but the message from Bridget, if you believe it's valid at all, was a lot of strokes. And it seems likely that the flagellation of Christ, which, if you remember, Pontius Pilate wanted to do it instead of the crucifixion, but then was overridden, the flagellation may be far more important from a medical point of view than it's been given credit for. And I want to talk about the cross and then the nails. And this is important within the same theme. Christ, according to the evidence I have, did not carry his cross. So why not? So let's just look at the mechanics of carrying the cross. Giotto and Fra Angelico chose this cross design for their paintings. I don't know why, but thereafter the Latin cross was usually used. It's easier to nail the King of the Jews plaque on the top. That may be the reason. And here you have Jesus carrying the cross on his own. Then as you go forward in time, Raffaello gives you the Latin cross and shows Christ falling, and Rubens much the same. In both cases, Simon of Cyrene is helping. But that is at variance with the gospel account, where Simon of Cyrene didn't just come and help, he was forced to carry the cross from the word go. So Christ probably never carried the cross. This is another, the same general way of portraying the event. Look at the cross and estimate how much it might weigh. This is from the Orthodox Church, which portrays the event in a different way. And here you have Simon carrying the cross by himself in accordance with the Gospels, and Christ not carrying the cross. So my question at this stage is, all the stories based on Christ carrying the cross, were they not true? And if they were not true, was Christ already too damaged to be able to carry the cross? Now, people do strange things, and this is Mr. Bevilacqua trying to find out what it felt like to carry a cross. So he built a cross, and he tried to carry it, and he fell down. And then used his bruises as ways of validating the Turin shroud. I don't know why he did it, but the important things that come from this are the difficulty of carrying a cross. But I thought you might be interested on the right here. You have an American priest called, bless him, Arthur Blessitt, who built a balsa wood cross of 20 kilos, and he carried it all the way around the world in imitation of Christ. Right, before we get on to the actual weight of the cross, well, I've written it here, cheating. Old cross estimated by Edwards, who looked into it in detail, to be 135 kilograms. Almost impossible for a man to carry, completely impossible for a man who's already half dead to carry. And even if only the crossbeam is being carried, that's still 45 kilos. And you had to go up a kilometer hill to Golgotha. So I think on just looking at the cross evidence, it's very unlikely that Christ was able to carry it. I've included this for a little bit of light relief. This is a Bible picture book, it's really an illustrated whole of the Bible, not just the Gospels, found in England, where you see the crucifix being prepared. Somebody's drilling a hole. But the main point here is that there is a drama going on. This is the blacksmith in blue, and he refused to make the crucifixion nails, saying that he had a bad hand. And here you can see his hand with spots on it. But he said, don't worry, my wife will do it. And there is his wife making a crucifixion nail. You can see her hammering away a red hot nail, very realistically. And here Richard Camber has helped me. This, and is supported by other evidence, is probably an early example of medieval anti-Semitism, because this woman is portrayed as Jewish with a bulbous nose. There are two bulbous noses in this picture, and this is, I don't think this has got anything to do with what really happened, but the myth goes on, and it's a lovely picture. Now, crucifixion nails, what actually happened? We're helped a little bit by archaeology. In Jerusalem, some 50 years ago, a heel bone was found with a nail going through it. And then more recently, 5 years ago, another one was found in Cambridge. And these are Roman period nails going through the heel bone, not through the front of the foot. And this is a model, this isn't archaeology, to show that this would mean that the feet had to be attached to the side of the cross rather than the front of the cross. And it's a far more violent attack on the body than just going through the tendons of the feet and arm. And this brings me to Alan Pascucci, who has helped me enormously with this talk. And this is a drawing that he did for a crucifix that he had been commissioned to sculpt. And here you can see a rare event, an accurate representation of where the feet and the nails should be. Unfortunately, Alan, I think I'm not misquoting you, the Australian church who commissioned, they would not accept this because they said it wasn't in the tradition of the usual crucifixion, so the feet had to be crossed over differently. Nearly finished with nails. You remember the Turin shroud, where the suggestion was that the nail went through the wrist. A surprising Frenchman called Mr. Barbet also thought the same thing, and he did a bizarre experiment. He got an amputated arm from his hospital, nailed it to a piece of wood, and then hung weights from it to see whether the nail would pull through the hand. And he put enough weights on until it pulled through. Then he did his maths to say how much pull would there be on two hands. And he concluded that it was impossible for the crucifixion to have happened through the hand, and it had to be through the wrist, which is a bit of a problem if you believe in St. Francis's stigmata being accurate. And if you think that was a strange and rather bizarre thing, Dr. Zubiger then disagreed with him, and he persuaded his medical students to be crucified. And he didn't do it with nails, he did it with ropes, and he put them on crosses in order to see what happened, and also to measure the amount of strain on the hand. And he completely refuted the surprising Dr. Barbet by saying that the hand could easily have sustained the body. And we're going to come back to his crucified volunteers a little bit later. And then the last two things about nails, if you look at all the paintings of nails, and there are so many thousands, and I've spent a lot of time looking at these nails, they come in curious they're designer nails. They're not old Roman nails. They have funny shapes. These are shapes that have been replicated in Donatello's Bargello sculpture. And this is one from the Opera del Duomo with this pointed head. And the most delicate is another Donatello in Santa Croce with a highly pointed head. Now, if you've done any carpentry and you try hammering a nail with a pointed head, it won't work. You'll slip off. So I think these representations are artistic license, and they're copying the very early pictures, and they're probably, in a way, giving Christ an elegant nail rather than the traditional one. Once I became obsessed by crucifixion nails, I found there is actually one for sale. One of the original crucifixion nails you can get on eBay for $1,600. So we're nearly finished. We've now just got to deal with the lance and the sponge, both only in St. John's Gospel. And just to remind you, the 7 last words of Christ, which are in St. John's Gospel, contains, shortly before his death, "I'm thirsty." And then, according to the Gospel, they, not saying who they are, found a pot of wine vinegar and a sponge and put it on the end of a stick and gave it to Christ to drink. And Christ drank, and then soon afterwards said, "It is finished. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," and he dies. This is of some medical interest because what is in the sponge? And you can remember from all sorts of films that rum was used as an anesthetic in military operations. And if you drank enough wine, it would dull pain and would be a kindness. And this was apparently often offered to the crucified person on the cross, usually mixed with herbs. And if you go into the pharmacology of this, these herbs, although tasting bitter, have medicinal properties of being anti-inflammatory and pain-killing. So it is just possible that this was, as it were, the last straw when his thirst was quenched with alcohol and herbs. And I'm now going to come to the lance, where there's quite a lot of misunderstanding about the lance. You remember that the centurion, whose name we know, stabbed the side. And there's a considerable amount of medical literature about where the lance went, and whether it went through the heart, and whether that was the cause of death. But it's a complete misunderstanding, because the Gospels actually state that the soldiers came to break the legs, and they broke the legs of the two thieves. And here you can see Giotto accurately showing you two all broken legs. But when they came to Christ, they found he was already dead. So they didn't break his legs. And they stabbed him in the side with a lance to confirm that he was dead. I now have to go medical. And if you have doubt about whether a patient had died or not, stabbing them in the side would not be a good way of finding out. But it's interesting that it's done. And then you have to go to John's Gospel, where he says the lance wound produced a sudden flow of blood in the water. And this has led to a lot of speculation about what came out. As very well illustrated here by this crucifixion in Manta, where there is water quite separate from the blood. And as you remember, the blood as it spurts out is sometimes caught in a chalice by angels. Now, there's a hopeless inconsistency here. If Christ were already dead at the time of the lance wound, blood would not spurt out because there is no blood pressure. It's difficult to understand the water. And here I'm indebted to Mark Roberts, who gave me the answer. This is not a description of a physical event. This is a symbolic event where water, baptism, one sacrament, blood, the Eucharist, second sacrament, are being portrayed at the moment of death. So I think it's completely wrong to get too medical about this. I think this is a theological picture, not a medical one. And St. John's Gospel is famous for doing this. It's for putting in theological points and relating to the Old Testament, one of which is that his bones could not be broken, because there's a quote in Isaiah that the sacrificial Christ must be intact. So his bones couldn't be broken. So I'm now finishing with looking at the German rationalist people who tried to produce arguments that he did not die. And these are some of the arguments: that he pretended to die, not very convincing; that he'd been administered soporific drugs by Luke, his physician; that he was in a temporary coma, he swooned, he was later resuscitated. And even the most bizarre one is that it was a very cold day, so he became cold and needed warming up later. And the most absurd of all is that he walked out and went to India. But there is a sect in India who believes this and goes on. So it is one of the difficulties of trying to do an analysis of what happened when you have so much legend and myth mixed up with it. This way of thinking is this rather nice quote from a German theologian. If Jesus had made his way out of the tomb bleeding, swelling, limping, they would not have called Jesus victorious out over death. They would have called the doctor. And that then stops. And then if you ask a lot of people, except that he died, what did he die of? And this is the last bit. And here we come to the famous Frenchman Barbet again, who produced a complicated argument, say that the weight of the body, legs and lower body, pulling on the diaphragm, which is the muscle that you breathe with, would have prevented breathing. And so he died of asphyxiation. And this is something which most people know. It doesn't stand up for two reasons. First of all, that the diaphragm is a muscle for inspiration, not expiration. You use it when you breathe in, and the diaphragm does that. You breathe out naturally by the elasticity of the lungs. So I think the argument was not a good one. But then we go back to Dr. Zülpicher's volunteers who he crucified, and they could breathe perfectly well for as long as they could stand being crucified. And the answer is not long. It hurts so much to be hanging from your arms that they asked to come down. But then if you go to the other evidence, and that is it often took 1 to 3 days to die, it can't have been this mechanism. So what was it? Well, this is amazing what people do with their time. This is a series of 44 different medical experts on their opinion as to why he died. And so you've got everything: lungs, bleeding, heart, kidney, blood clots, and they're probably all right. The flagellation would have done all of these things. And then the crucifixion on top. And I use slightly different evidence from an intensive care unit where they looked at the cause of death in nearly 1,000 patients who came in with traffic accidents and severe trauma. And if only one organ has been hit, very few people die. If 4 have, everybody dies. And I think that, so for me, this is the more likely cause of death. And I'm therefore going to conclude, and it's up to you to see if you agree with me or not, that he did die for multiple reasons from the evidence. He died of multi-organ, multi-system failure. And now I want to just finish by saying thank you to Timothy Verne, who very kindly, I went to see him because I wanted to run this past him to make sure I didn't make any theological mistakes and didn't say anything that was theologically offensive. And so he gave me 2 to 3 hours of his time. And at the end of it, he said, no, it's all right, you're not going to offend anybody. The thing is, you're asking the wrong question. And in that, he's completely right. I'm asking a detailed mechanical question because that's what interested me, and that's what my grandchildren asked me to do. The much more important question is how the whole story of Christ's life and his crucifixion has had this fundamentally enormous impact on Western civilization. And here I've just listed the number of Christians there are in the world, which to my surprise, at 2.5 million, exceeds the number of Muslims and way before the others. So thank you for listening. I'm not telling you what happened. I'm just presenting evidence. It's up to you. Thank you.
For your unique take on history of religion and art. So, as always, we'll now move to the question and answer stage of the evening. If you want to ask a question and you're in the room, put your hand up and I'll bring you the microphone. If you're on the Zoom and you want to join in, you can put something on the chat, or else you can, if you like, unmute and talk to us. We'll hear you. So, has anyone got a thought, question?
Hello, Beatrice.
Okay, so who would like to go first? Anyone on the Zoom and chat? So,
can I just ask Mark Roberts if his view on the whole thing, because Mark knows much more about all of this than I do.
The person my colleague Alan. Brilliant lecture. My question is, you look through all the different crucifixions. Do you see a change in iconography from early Christian, Middle Ages, Renaissance, Baroque? Does it change with the interpretation? The change with the generational type of thing? How does it evolve? Because it seems like people are getting most of their information from the art,
Yeah.
the actual Gospels.
Well, first of all, thank you for lending me that book, which goes into this. I think that I can sort of see it in three phases. One is purely symbolic, up to the first 1,000 years. Then you get the church representing Christ in a certain way. And then as you go into naturalism, it just becomes the naturalistic, probably quite accurate representation of suffering and dying. Once you get beyond 1500, 1600, I really can't see a pattern anymore. There are plenty of crucifixions. They're usually pretty crowded with lots more people than were likely to have been there. But could you mind answering your own question? Because you will know it better than me.
No, well, you've been going over this a lot more. Eventually, was the very first image with those orant position type of, and how it changes to the Grunwald, and how it seems like that the religion was being how do you say it interpreted by the artists, and it puts a lot of importance on the artist's interpretation, and the people are actually looking to the artist to interpret it for them.
I mean, I would agree with that. For me, it looks as if most paintings are paintings of paintings. And from time to time, painters change their slant a bit and a new fashion develops. But I'd need to have more knowledge of the history of art. It's just interesting that the suffering Christ comes in after about 1,200 years, and from then onwards, it's all suffering. And it may be that this is the church teaching, remembering just what a humiliating death this was in the early part of the Christian church, when Christianity is establishing itself as a world religion, to have your number one figure represented as a criminal is not the way they like to do it. And so he's represented as a priest. And then later, it becomes permissible to represent Christ as a suffering man rather than as a triumphant godlike figure. But it's the painter's choice rather than what actually happened.
Well, thank you. This was a fascinating talk, Duncan. Thank you for praising me with the point about the blood and water. I wanted to ask you about the Santa Sabina wooden doors. What's your explanation for there being no crosses and the rather odd position of the arms?
Yes, I wish I could know. I think it's because it's purely symbolism, no attempt at saying what actually happened. And the crucified position is the important thing, rather similar to the two angels that we see, one coming to St. Francis, who is as if crucified. And I think once you've understood what it means, you don't actually need the cross to identify who is being portrayed. But you've got to wonder what the craftsman was asked to do, and whether there is a purely mechanical reason. Maybe he would have to put another crossbar into a door, but he's already finished. I don't know.
Thanks very much. A wonderful talk. An observation and a question. I mean, first of all, I wanted to congratulate you for unequivocally demonstrating, without any shadow of doubt, that 12-year-olds ask the best questions.
Yes, no question.
I mean, it is a simple fact of humanity that 12-year-olds, they're old enough to be able to frame these questions, but haven't quite got so old enough that they start worrying about what people will think of the questions that they ask. So they're to be treasured, and it's a time we should all devote strongly to encouraging their questions. But I wondered, have you shared this with your grandchildren?
Well, you know,
in any sense? And what I'm really interested to know, I imagine obviously you presented it in a slightly different way, but what was their reaction and what were their follow-up questions like?
Well, first of all, I agree with you completely. They asked the best questions. And I wouldn't have done any of this without being pushed into it by his revealing my ignorance. I didn't know anything about this. Then, of course, children, they lose interest. And so when I go back to him 6 months later and say, "Do you remember what you said?" "No, I can't remember." So, but from his point of view, it was, well, I just remember him saying, "No, do doctors ever make that mistake?" "Yes, there's something." "Well, that's it then," he said, and wandered off. So, no, I think it's a good point. Maybe I'll go to him again when he's theologically a little older.
Any more contributions? I'm struck by that very first one, the church door. That when you did it again, the gesture is also a gesture of kind of welcome.
Yes, welcome is a good. It is.
A lot of the early,
The church. You'll come into the church. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Which is an interesting inversion of the fact, which was actually a horrifically cruel execution.
Yeah.
Everything but a welcome.
Can I just make one plug? If any of you are interested in seeing a film, there are more than 100 films, Passion of Christ, all starting about 1927 with Cecil B. DeMille's a silent movie, black and white, and it's a fantastic watch. Really, you can get it on YouTube. You don't pay anything, but you will see acting as good as any. All the acting is done with gestures and eyes, and not a single word. And I think he does it better than anybody. And then other people put in, beautiful actors and so on. But that and the Mel Gibson film, which is horrible, but may well be true.
And I thought, any more first of that?
Thank you, Duncan. I wondered about the letter that Christ wrote with Accra, because I didn't think he ever wrote a single word. And what letters are Latin given?
Eusebius writing in Latin, and I don't know, I haven't actually chased that one down. So probably it's a Latin translation he's bothering with. But it's just unusual to get that whole story within the church history book. And I don't know whether you'd all heard of it before. I'd never heard of it. But the idea of Christ writing a letter, well, presumably dictating a letter and having it written, I don't know whether people did their own writing then. But it's a fascinating story. But if you ask Orthodox Christians, some people have heard of it. And the Mandelion is a very common icon in the Eastern Church.
Thank you very much for the diagnosis. From doctor to doctor, I think that Jesus Christ is quite difficult. First of all, because we don't know anything about his previous history, medical history, his sanitary dossier, and probably there is some risk factors. Anyway, Duncan is a difficult patient because he's half human and half divine. Yeah. So I think that you are basing onto the diagnosis is based in the iconography and onto the pictures and paintings. And when he smiles at the cross, it's more divine. When he is suffering, it's more human.
Yeah.
Don't you think it depends on the commitment of all these paintings through the century? And probably the reference is the different period the church has passed.
I think it Exactly, because I think that the paintings nearly always, particularly if they're on church walls, they're commissioned by the priest, who, as in Alan's experience, knows what he wants to have portrayed. So, and he's not going to be particularly interested in the biological accuracy of what's being portrayed, but the church will have a definite point of view, probably in the nature of the sermons at the time, which begin to focus on suffering rather than majesty. And so then the painters have to do what they're told.
My question, which I suddenly remembered again, was did you do any research onto these groups of very serious Catholics, often in Spain and elsewhere, who actually crucify themselves?
Yeah.
And what actually happened?
Particularly in the Philippines. Yeah. No, I don't know. But I think, no, I don't know. I just know about the volunteers and how far the people take it. It sounds from the volunteers as if the pain is endurable for about 15 to 20 minutes. Now, I don't know how long they stay up on the cross in the Philippines.
Just tell me to Google it. More
Yeah.
details. Oh, does somebody want to talk to us on Zoom? Someone want to unmute and talk to us? What was on the chat?
I do it.
Let's see. Well, we've got some fan mail in the chat. I'm not sure we've got a question. Oh, yeah, wait. It's fan mail. Bad people say fantastic and fascinating. So there's something else. Yeah.
I'm curious about what your sense of the evolution of the imagery as it got more and more literal from the very beginning down to the Mel Gibson depiction. What role did you feel knowledge about medicine and knowledge about the body and the medical processes and human processes and body? What do you think the relationship was between the literalness with which or the increasing literalness and cruelty of the crucifixion as it's evolved relative to medical science's knowledge about human body systems?
I think that first of all, human body medical knowledge comes very late at the same time as the Germans are beginning to ask the question. And I don't think that knowledge has influenced the iconography at all. I think that the focus on suffering seems to have increased all the way through. And it's an unfortunate part of the human race. People like looking at violence. And there you have the arguments about who is paying for the painting and how is the painter's career going to develop, none of which will be very interested in the biology. So I think the further on you get, in every respect, the further away you get from the reality of the event.
Another good example of that is the depictions of hell.
Yeah.
Where you think of yet more extreme,
horrible tortures.
Horrible.
Yes. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Anyhow, any more? Before we get even darker, more grisly. I think we better have a glass of wine.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks everyone, and thank you all Zoomers for being with us. Making sure we've got no Zoom questions. No, just the fan mail. And for those in the room, we now go through to the other room where we have a nice glass of wine from our season sponsor, Poggio Porcelli. Very nice winery. And it just remains for me to thank Duncan very much indeed. Oh, and I haven't thanked this week's sponsor, which is...
Yes, Penny.
Penny's who sponsored that. Penny, I'm so sorry.
Well done, Penny.
Thank you
Thank you very much. Well, thanks for letting me do it.
the mindset behind it, because in medieval times